doctor?
My wife, sick.
What's wrong with her?
She wrong.
She's not right?
That not my wife.
I mean, she's,
No, different. That not my wife.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and returning to us after a long time being away, for the first time since I believe it was our episode on Curtis Harrington's Night Tide, starring Dennis Hopper. Returning once again, our illustrious guest host, Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm the world's least qualified film critic. I am a contributing writer at thefilmstage.com and just a person with bad opinions on movies who occasionally gets lucky and gets to talk to people who matter.
This not being one of those times.
This being, let's call it somewhere in the middle. You know, I mean, it's not quite on the level of having a phone call with Peter Bogdanovich, but it's not quite sitting around in my room either.
You have met him in person, right?
No. I did a phone interview.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I remember. Yeah, Did he cuss as much as I imagined he wouldn't?
No, but he was, the sort of the kind of withering demeanor. That's not an act.
Just tired of all the bullshit.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, also maybe because I'm super self-conscious and only remember negative things. But there was one point where I think I asked him a sort of kind of hardball question. It was well, so. Your movies are all about nostalgia for old Hollywood, but today some people might say that that old Hollywood was sort of representative of a socially unequal era. So what would you say to that? And I just remember he got pissed off, those people would be ignorant. I mean, he was sort of one of the pioneers of deep cut nostalgia.
Yeah.
New Hollywood.
Yeah.
I mean, nostalgia being a big part of all slices of New Hollywood, but he was one of the ones who very specifically pioneered the meticulous pastiche of these specific icons of Hollywood nostalgia, not totally uncritically either. He,
right.
Remixed them in interesting ways, but from what I understand, that was part of the whole. The parts of Tarantino's shtick that weren't cribbed from Godard were cribbed from Bogdanovich, whom I can say who refers to Quentin on a first name basis.
Nice.
Along with Wes of Anderson and
yeah.
Noah of Baumbach. Is it Baumbach or Baumbach? I never figured that out.
I think it's Baumbach. I guess it's cool that we're bringing up the Hollywood Renaissance because, this is the first time in a long time that you've been back on the podcast, but I had been talking to you a while about the idea of bringing you on to discuss today's topic, which is the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Previously, I've already covered Jack Finney's novel on another episode.
You podcast about books?
I have a little special segment called the
Retro.
Book. Yeah, I'm I'm so old school, man. I'm turning through pages. I'm getting paper cuts. I'm dog-earing those pages, even though the librarian and the teacher says that's that's offensive to the book. You're destroying the integrity of the book.
You can't know what a podcast is and know what a book is. You have to choose one generation.
Yeah, it's true. I have definitely crossed the line. I am miscegenating the genres. But yeah, I did an episode on Jack Finney's book, The Body Snatchers. I did a follow-up on the 1956 film adaptation, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Don Siegel. And even in both of those episodes, I was sure to end each of them with an audio excerpt from the 78 film, because my plan was always for it to be a trilogy in which I sort of tried to trace the history of this specific story, starting with Jack Finney's novel, working through its first adaptation, and then culminating in the late 70s adaptation. But even then, I realized, as soon as I realized that you were a particular fan of Invasion, the 78 film, I knew I had to get you involved in some respect, just so like I just felt like this wasn't one of the ones that I could just do a sort of long form essay. I think it really is a movie that's worth discussing, and not just me sort of bloviating about my own interpretations of it.
Yeah. Well, so I'm now in an interesting position where you've read the novel. I have not read the novel, but I have now seen, as I was just telling you before, I've now seen all 4 adaptations.
Yes, yeah, definitely one of the most prolific works in American science fiction. Adapted 4 different times as a film. The first, of course, the Don Siegel one. The second, the Philip Kaufman one, distributed by United Artists. It's United Artists. And then Abel Ferrara of Bad Lieutenant fame did a 90s adaptation of it. Of course, the most recent version, that would had to be like 2006, 2007, right?
2007, and directed by the guy who did Downfall.
What, really?
Yeah, really. The German guy.
So
who did that? Yes. Sorry, I'm just laughing at my own stupidity here.
I think we'll definitely have to cover at least, if not each, their separate episode, like maybe in the future, maybe follow up. Because I'm definitely interested to see the Ferrara version, although like he doesn't strike me as the sort of director, to have the sort of specificity of vision that I think is required for the text.
Well, if anything, it makes you appreciate that the first 2 movies had, despite the sort of like inherent kind of campiness of the subject, they have kind of a light touch about it that Ferrara that's not really in his playbook. I mean, it's not a bad movie,
right?
But I guess some of the ways it tries to yet again sort of remold and revisit and reinterpret the basic story for a different topic in a different generation is kind of interesting, but like it's only interesting kind of abstractly, because grammatically I didn't find it very engaging. And it's just like it doesn't introduce like the 78 version, we're doing this all out of order, but the 78 version is interesting because it both changes it fundamentally changes the setting of the previous adaptation, while also sort of expanding on the sort of like visual and kind of thematic and auditory concepts in ways that are novel and interesting. And the Ferrara version doesn't really introduce anything significantly new to the table that was not already in the 78 version.
Yeah.
It's just sort of more of it.
I'm really glad you brought up the extent to which the 78 version kind of expanded the sort of visual potential of like, I mean, I guess part of it is just this whole like interesting idea of how in the 70s and then throughout the 80s, we occasionally see these remakes of classic science fiction and horror movies of the 50s, of which, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is probably the most notable and the most beloved. But of course, you can also think of David Cronenberg's The Fly. You can think of The Blob was remade in 1988. Also, Tobe Hooper of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist fame did a remake of Invaders from Mars.
You forgot The Thing. How could you forget The Thing?
Of course, The Thing. The Thing from another world.
But speaking of which, I realize now also They Live is sort of kind of an unofficial Body Snatchers movie.
Yeah, not even unofficial. I mean, there's an essential amount of DNA between all these movies, and I think it's like I think what it comes down to is that, especially in the 70s and 80s, like, I mean, historically, there's always been this sort of overlap between all of these sort of science fiction or horror movies, but with a commentary or a satirical element to them. Like, I think there, just as much as you can say, like, there's obviously DNA of the Body Snatchers in They Live, but there's also, interestingly enough, there's kind of like DNA of the modern zombie movie in the 78 film. You know, the 78 Body Snatchers even comes out in the same year as Dawn of the Dead. And, like, even in the depiction of the pod people in the 78 film, it's strikingly less human, I think, you know, occasionally than in the
I
56 film
thing.
where it's like, again, it's like these
the pod people in 78 they don't really, I mean, there are like a couple scenes where they sort of ostensibly explain their motivations, but even then they're sort of unknowable. Compared to 56.
Anyway, but like I guess I'll table those points for now, because I did want to focus just, you know, you had brought this to my attention before we did the episode, and I wasn't aware of it, but this episode will be coming out on the 26th, following, because I'm unlocking the previous episodes I've done, so we'll have like a nice trilogy of stuff we're covering, but this will be coming out on the 26th, and you had brought it to my attention that on the 20th, unfortunately, the director of photography of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Michael Chapman, passed away, 84 years of age, so he lived a long, good life, and I was just looking through his filmography, and just, there's really some amazing entries here. Like, he, of course, begins in 1973, his first DP job is Hal Ashby's The Last Details, starring what's his name again? The Shining guy. Here's Johnny. Why am I forgetting his name?
Nicholson?
Jack Nicholson. Yeah, Jack Nicholson. Yeah,
Okay.
He
You know, I haven't seen that one, but I do know who Jack Nicholson is.
Yeah, but he also is associated heavily with Martin Scorsese. He did the cinematography for Taxi Driver, The Last Waltz, Raging Bull, and also the Michael Jackson music video for Bad, which is a excellent music video. There's also
he specializes in creepy urban nighttime shots.
Right.
We can conclude.
Yeah, he's definitely got an eye, and of course, like, he also did later in life, he probably became more famous for doing the cinematography for Joel Schumacher's The Lost Boys, the teen vampire movie. Ivan Reitman's Kindergarten Cop, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Evolution, the movie which came out in 2001, which was basically Ghostbusters but with aliens. The Andrew Davis, The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford, and of course Space Jam, which for a minute.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's
an accomplishment.
So yeah, like, think of all the DNA that's there. You know, Invasion of the
rest
Body
made his
Snatchers.
mark on cinema, but Space Jam made his mark on the internet.
And of course, like, you know, there's obviously a relationship between Space Jam and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because what is Invasion of the Body Snatchers if not another movie in which human essence, this time NBA basketball players, is stolen and corrupted by nefarious creatures from beyond the stars. I guess, you know, so I guess I just wanted to touch on, you know, just, you know, pour one out for Michael Chapman, a real one. He had actually done 4 films with Philip Kaufman, the director of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the other being The White Dawn from 1974, The Wanderers, which came out just the year after Invasion, and then finally in 1993, an adaptation of Michael Crichton's Rising Sun. I think the thing is, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is from the cinematography to the direction, to the writing, to the performances, to the sound design.
The sound design by, incidentally, I know this from following your advice and watching the Blu-ray featurettes, sound design by Ben Burtt of Star Wars.
Yeah.
Who gave us, with that movie, several more of the most iconic sound effects in 70s cinema.
Yeah, definitely. Like there's
You know, after, and we're, you know, like not far apart either. I mean, it's came out in like a year after the original Star Wars, so he just, you know, scooted right along from the lightsaber and the blaster sound to the Body Snatcher scream.
yeah, it's
He got by recording a pig squeal.
what all of these factors sort of every single aspect of the movie, technical and performance wise, I think is virtually perfect. And it's one of those things where I guess we kind of needed to go ahead and just, honor Michael Chapman because he's an integral part of what makes Invasion of the Body Snatchers such an arresting film, and what, even in the context of the 70s and the early 80s, where there was a lot of really interesting horror film coming out. And I guess I wanted to get your sort of idea of, like, how Chapman's cinematography is uniquely, lends itself so uniquely to making Invasion such a I guess I'll say powerful film, like it.
I mean, so this time watching it, I finally went back and watched the 56 version and watched that and the 78 version like 24 hours apart.
Mm.
And so everything I was noticing about the 78 version was sort of observing like by contrast to the 56 version.
Yeah.
So one thing about it being it's a much more visual film, which is probably not surprising,
Right.
especially given both the era and the budget that produced the Don Siegel version. That one surprised me for being much heavier on, or much richer in subtext than I was expecting. The thing everyone knows about that movie now is, okay, it's it's the Red Scare metaphor. So I was expecting it to be like kind of characteristically like 50s on the nose.
Very heavy-handed. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of not. The metaphor is more abstract and oblique than people give it credit for.
Yeah, definitely.
And I say that in a positive way. I think it's, it's not that it's, vague or just sort of a gesture at meaning. I think it's more that it's more concerned with these kind of more elemental, like, degrees of kind of psychological, psychoanalytical subtext that the sort of the most kind of basic elemental level of like fear of conformity, fear of being duplicated, fear of the idea of human experience being something that can be synthetically mass produced.
Yeah.
And in that light, I think it could be equally as it could be equally read as a critique of kind of the sort of the heart of 50s white suburbia.
Yes.
And its repressed sense of something being deeply wrong. And one thing that struck me watching it is that one, we see in some detail characters freaking out about imposter people before we actually see any people who are demonstrably imposters.
Yeah, they're all.
That's a difference from the 78 version, where
they're mostly off screen. We mostly just hear about them. It's very
And initially, we only hear about them from women and children.
Yes, that's another big element of it. Like the people who seem the most susceptible to these paranoias do seem to be children and women, and then that becomes this weird thing where, of course, they're also the least likely to be taken seriously, the more likely to be prescribed and treated. It's like at a certain level, it's like the same thing within the novel, where it's like, okay, well, what are people supposed to do? Believe the imposters are really among us, or do you prescribe? But I think there's definitely an element of that in the film, like
And
definitely.
also, I think, yeah, there's also a sort of an element of like, the almost like the people who are the only people who are willing to say initially that the people around them are imposters are the people who are sort of by social designation uh, are considered to be like it's acceptable for them to sort of have exterior outbursts of emotion or emotional reasoning,
Mm.
um, and the men being much more sort of dictated by
Conventions of rationality, of
yeah, and
repressing
conventions of
emotion. Because yeah, there's also a great deal of like themes in the original about the repression of emotion that's delivered. Like obviously, our two protagonists, Miles and Becky, they're both divorcees who it's intimated that they may have had like a sort of a, if not a consummated but a romantic relationship when they were in high school, but they both moved on and ended up in marriages that inevitably ended in divorce. And we talk, and they joke about it, like Miles jokes about the fact that he's a failure as a man. But that's another great thing about the original film, is that the extent to which that if you compare it to a lot of other sci-fi movies from back then, even when these are movies where there's a scientist or a doctor as the protagonist, they're usually far more conventionally masculine. But I think you're right that there's a dynamic here at play where the men are sort of programmatically expected to view everything through this sort of anti-intuitive rationalist lens. But even at that level, it doesn't really convey, nor is it good for them on a personal level. Like like you could very much interpret the entire film as basically emanating from Miles' just basic dysfunction of feeling like, that he has fundamentally failed at the one thing as a man that he was supposed to do, which is, be a breadwinner, have a child, and
well,
contribute to the perpetuation of this, this small town, and be a part of the sort of the ferment of this, idyllic sort of this American stereotype of this pastoral, interconnected, but fundamentally conservative, ecosystem.
right. Well, it's the '50s dream, and the the protagonist and the love interest, the whole basis of their connection is that they're both kind of locked out just by circumstances of life. They have been denied access to the 50s suburbia kind of utopia, um, which they're starting off from a sense of alienation that uh, grows and literalizes over the course of the film. But I mean, it's interesting in that it is much more, it's a much like psychological deep dive and much richer in symbolism, I think, than any of the other adaptations.
Really? Well, I guess
I mean,
it
I,
is less literal. Yeah, I will give you that. Like, I think that is true. It's a much.
I mean, the '78 one is still my favorite on the whole.
Oh yeah, and
Uh,
I think I'm in the same place, because like I'm like this there the 78 film, there's definitely a hard dividing line when it comes to fans of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's sort of like, I guess I'll go back to the Pulp Fiction reference, where it's like some people like Elvis, some people like the Beatles, some people like both, but nobody likes them both the same. And over the course of the last few months, having seen both of these films at least 3 times, uh, I have to say that I vacillated hard back and forth between which I preferred. And at the end of the day, like, I'm definitely not one of these people who ends up, like, saying that, like, well, this movie that was made 22 years after the original, this is clearly superior to the one that was made in a completely different, historical and industrial context. But I do think that I think I have to, I think the distinction is that the original 1956 film is absolutely one of the best science fiction films and horror films to come out of the 50s. But I will say that the 78 film, sort of going back to what we were talking about, just with all of the elements that are involved, I think the 78 film is just one of the best American films made, period.
Well, it's just much more cinematic.
Well, yeah.
I mean, it's, it does all this, like, it conveys tons of visual, nonverbal information.
Yeah. But it's also just...
This is despite the fact that it does kind of explain more and is more literal.
Yeah, it's definitely more literalistic, but even the literalistic elements are interesting, which I think we can get into when we discuss the film a little more. But I think what it really comes down to is that the 78 film is like the platonic ideal of a film that could have come out of the new Hollywood moment, because it is at once, just like you say, abundantly straightforward and surface oriented. You can go into this film and understand almost everything on just an intuitive, visceral level. It's a completely populist concept playing on fears that are legible to everybody. But at the same time, every other level of the film, especially in terms of its aesthetics, especially in terms of its cinematography, its sound design, the sort of subtleties of the writing and the performance, all of them are working together in this mode that is very typical of the new Hollywood, or the Hollywood Renaissance, which really at this period was kind of coming to its end. Was really sort of starting to bottom out with these really excessive prestige pictures that didn't make enough money to make the investment worthwhile. Meanwhile, this movie comes out of the gate at only, like, costing a little under $4 million. And it's just, I think it's just a perfect synthesis of the American Renaissance instinct to try to push the aesthetic and narrative boundaries of the medium so that even the most straightforward and popular concepts can become this thing where you're not just appealing to people on a puerile level. You're kind of getting them invested in something that is sensually and intellectually stimulating. Like, and I think that's what really, for me, sells me on the 78 film. Which is, again, like you're saying, it's not to knock the 56 film at all. But you're right that, like, there's something that the 78 film gains, even if it is a little more literalistic, that the 56 film is just more compromised. Even with all the ambition that Siegel has, I think there's a certain level to it where it's just... I mean, obviously, they're both adaptations of Finney's novel, but I just think that, yeah, the even before the studio interference in the 56 film, I think there's a lot of, and I go into this in the episode where I covered it, but, like, I think there's a lot of elements of it that even before the studio interference, there's clear sort of compromises and things that really don't gel together, because I think you're right that when they did that adaptation, the filmmakers were operating on a much more psychoanalytical level and on a much more abstract level, and it works in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways I just don't think it really coheres.
Were you aware that Siegel wanted to have a darker ending?
Oh yeah, the original ending is the one that's still there in the film. It just ends with Miles, Kevin McCarthy, screaming at everybody in traffic to stop, but then the camera pulls back and he's just alone in this sea of, I mean, what are these automobiles but, pods? What is this flow of human traffic but, just a bunch of pod people?
In one of the disc featurettes, Philip Kaufman is talking about a meeting that he had with Siegel before starting production on the film.
Yeah, to get his blessing,
Yeah, and he just says that he says that, like, Siegel, while he was proud of the original, he did have his regrets. And specifically, I guess one, he had wanted to have more humor in the film.
Yes.
And I guess there was an early version screened that had more comic elements in it that the studio wanted taken out. And I guess the other one being that he had wanted to have a more bleak ending, but instead we get sort of the not quite plausible last minute Deus Ex Machina, the responsible authorities suddenly come to understand that the threat is real.
Yeah.
But I mean, I didn't know that he had just like wanted to just cut out stuff. I had figured that it seemed like the logical ending would have been like he gets to the seemingly responsible authorities, but then it's not clear. There's ambiguity over whether they are pod people or not.
Right, yeah. Which is sort of the tact that, yeah, it is true, isn't it? With Philip Kaufman's version, and of course the screenplay was written by W.D. Richter, and the impression that I got from looking into the production behind the film, it seemed like they were like they began shooting without a finished script, and so like I think like there's a great improvisational quality to a lot of parts of the film. But yeah, like there's even that scene where like Donald Sutherland's character Matthew, he's about to call the FBI, tried to get in touch with the FBI, and Jeff Goldblum as Jack is like, what are you talking about? They're all already pod people. Why are you expecting them to help?
Who are you calling?
Washington.
What, the CIA, the FBI? They're all pods already.
Well, that's another aspect of the film that, like, both of the movies, and I guess this is really common to all four adaptations, try to hit this with varying degrees of success, but they're very intensely zeitgeisty.
Yeah.
In the 56 one, in kind of a more, arguably sort of more like, texturally, interpretively interesting, abstract way, partly probably because the abstraction was just the necessity of the studio censorship of the day. Just you can't
show the bodies disintegrating,
right? But also like you can't be overtly critical of sort of the American experiment of the 50s,
right?
So you have to sort of mask it behind several layers of kind of psychoanalytic symbolism.
Yeah, Daniel Mainwaring, the screenwriter for the original film, he had actually written another film called The Lawless, directed by Joseph Losey, which is a very similar film, except it's instead of being an alien invasion movie, it's about a Mexican youth who is wrongfully accused of killing a police officer. And basically it's about, again, it's a very similar setting, small town Americana, a bunch of parochial white people up in arms. And, it has to be like, there's a white savior character who has to be the defender of civil liberty and of rationality and of also just emotion and humanity. And you do see little bits of that in the 56 film, and I'm glad you mentioned that, like, there is that thing where it's conventionally interpreted as a Red Scare film, but I think you're right that there's something that is just far more germane to the way the film depicts this small town itself as the monster, as this thing that is threatening to engulf and assimilate and destroy the sort of individuality of everything that is within it.
Yeah, I mean, it may not even necessarily be that it's a monster, but it's a battleground.
Yeah.
And a battleground hidden behind, white picket fences and smiling, happy, waspy people. Yeah, I mean, I think also something that is sort of more personally, I don't know, kind of more intimate about the 56 version than any of the others is the idea of a community turning in on itself.
Yeah.
And the idea that you don't know your neighbors or your neighbors aren't your neighbors. And it's fun. Like the 78 version goes for something fundamentally different by moving the setting to San Francisco, and then its calling card becomes urban alienation.
Right.
The idea that it's not about it's not about your neighbors being pod people. It's about the strangers on the street being pod people.
I'd keep seeing these people, all recognizing each other. Something was passing between them all. Some secret.
And there are all these great shots of just like people on the street and with wearing sort of, kind of ambiguously just sort of blank expressions that you're clearly meant to wonder and not have an obvious answer whether they're pod people or they're just city people.
Right. And let's be clear here, the expressions that they have, these sort of affectless, vacant, dead-eyed expressions and these semi-suspicious expressions, let's be absolutely clear here, that's just the way that people look. That's just the way that people in an urban environment move. And yeah, like I think maybe you can comment upon how Michael Chapman actually got a lot of these urban shots, especially the ones.
The insert shots were just Chapman just walking around capturing real people.
Yeah, definitely shots of like, especially when Donald Sutherland is like, he's going to all the pay phones because he's paranoid that like maybe there's someone tapping the phones at his office, so he's just going through all the different pay phones. Especially in those shots, there's a lot of great almost cinema verite kind of shooting where
there's a lot of handheld shots.
Yeah, lots of handheld, a lot of shooting from the hip, like
sort of up facing shots at just random people on the street. So with the 56 version, the Red Scare stuff, like it's not, as a reading of the film, it's not totally outrageously off,
right? In
the sense that there's that it's totally disconnected from what's there. It's overblown. But it's there's an element of it. It's just one ingredient in the film's sort of zeitgeist stew, because it's trying to sort of pull something out of kind of a deep American subconscious.
Right.
And so the Red Scare stuff is one ingredient there. So where the Siegel film was informed to some extent by Red Scare, 78 film is unmissably Watergate.
Yes.
And not just Watergate, but like the Mansons, the obviously Cold War stuff.
Yeah. I mean, just the Washington Post Vietnam, the declassification of the Vietnam papers, saying the government had explicitly lied to us about the success in the Vietnam conflict. All of these, the correlation of all of these different events, these high-profile events, the decline of the countercultural movement, all of these things sort of coalescing into a unique period of not just tremendous distrust in authority, but a sort of inwardly drawn neurotic distrust of other people,
and even of the self.
Right, exactly.
Kaufman in the featurette talks about the me generation of the 70s and how that inspired the inclusion of the whole like Leonard Nimoy subplot, where he's sort of a hacky pop psych guru.
Yeah.
Which who basically whereas in the 56 version, this sort of, you have the sort of the people in the small town community basically socially gaslighting the people who notice the pod people.
Right.
Here you have Leonard Nimoy doing it himself personally.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing, is that, like, and the fundamental thing that changes when you move the setting of the film when you move it from the parochial rural setting to the urban setting, you're like you say, you move it from a place where there is this sort of, even if it's a kind of a myth, there's an entrenched sense that there's some sort of community, and the movie definitely plays to that veneer, like, all of the different, the one-off lines of dialogue in which, Miles talks about how, like, I remember when that used to be the most thriving stand in the area. It's like, and there goes so-and-so who I know personally. Here, I'm going to pat Johnny on the head because I know him personally. This very closely knit social ecosystem, whereas the sort of...
It's a totally different kind of creepy and a totally different kind of alienation that each evokes.
Right. It's a sense of betrayal. It's a sense of... It's also a sense of being left behind, or not being, or basically realizing something that is just sort of sublimated but horrific about that sort of environment, and not being able to go back. Whereas in the sort of cosmopolitan 70s, in this urban 70s, there is no community. There's very much this, everybody is so atomized and alienated from each other. Like, there are social groups, but there are friend groups, but there's no real trust of authority. There's no real, like, guarantee of safety. There's no, like, real... it's like it becomes this weird thing where it's like, I think it was also a brilliant move, I think, to, as opposed to Miles Bennell, Matthew Bennell in the remake, to change him from a general practitioner to being a
bureaucrat.
A bureaucrat, yes, a civil servant with the health department. Yeah, like, and
that's another thing that, the 78 version, I mean, for all you were saying about, like, sort of how original and, kind of groundbreaking was, at the same time, it's kind of very much not original or groundbreaking, in the sense that it's another fine entry in the line of the 70s conspiracy thriller.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
It's, and you can and it's that mashed with the B movie alien invasion pulp. But it's in that sense, it's a more political film than the 56 version.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's this big emphasis on, people are there's the conspiracy is, goes up to the top, man. It's happening all around us, and people are sleeping and they're looking inward, and they're not processing it, and the authorities are telling them not to pay it any mind, so they're not.
Right, and people are in denial. Like, and Jeff Goldblum has that great line where it's like, he says it's a where he's complaining about Leonard Nimoy's book because he wants to read his poetry at the very boutique, new agey, independent bookstore. But Leonard Nimoy, who's playing... What's the name of Leonard Nimoy's character? Dr. Kibner. He has a new sort of, again, pop psychology book that's out. And so he can't read his poetry because basically everyone is just enthralled with Kibner. And, he's talking to Donald Sutherland, who's just trying to get on the phone with somebody. And he says it's a conspiracy. And Donald Sutherland asks, what's a conspiracy? And he just says, everything.
Right, of course, it's a big conspiracy.
What's a conspiracy?
Everything.
I think it might have been in the same featurette that you had watched where they talked about the sort of things that Don Siegel wasn't able to get away with in the original, where Kaufman talked about being interested in trying to make the remake have more comic levity. And it's a really pitch black comedy, because basically the recurring joke throughout the movie is just that at a intuitive level, everybody knows that the invasion has already happened, that they're just, like, slowly realizing, like, just how much, like, there's very little difference between this sort of pod people invasion and the kind of alienated, dispiriting life that they come to know. Like, I especially think Veronica Cartwright gives a fantastic performance as Jack's wife, Elizabeth. No, not Elizabeth. Jack's wife, Nancy. And they both own... Again, they're very much of the moment, very much of the post-countercultural, post-hippie, new agey holistic medicine culture where they have a mud bath house where, like people can come and they can sit in baths of mud and then wash off and then get a shiatsu massage.
And she also, I had forgotten this in one line, references the Chariots of the Gods.
Right, yeah, there's definitely a lot of like deep cut references to like specific conspiracy theories and to not even necessarily conspiracy theories, but just to works of esoterica. Like, at one point, like there's a guy in the mud house. He's reading this book called Worlds in Collision. And Worlds in Collision isn't even really a conspiracy book, but it is this very controversial work of like sort of pseudoscience written by a guy named Immanuel Velikovsky, which basically proposes that at some point that like Venus, it's basically one of these books that it's part of this genre of books that emerged in the 50s and 60s, but attained really renewed popularity in the 70s and the 80s, and even kind of attaining a kind of mainstream cult status, where it takes a view of history through the lens of comparative mythology, where it looks at all of these cataclysms that are reported in these mythologies of all of these different cultures, and it basically proposes this absurd pseudoscientific conclusion that like Venus was ejected from Jupiter and was a comet that came in close proximity to the Earth and caused all of these cataclysms and then rebounded again. Like, it's thoroughly empirically discredited. But it's very much, it builds upon, once you know those sorts of things, it really builds upon your sense of the milieu of the film and the really fascinating cultural context, where you really start to see the opening of America's third eye, for better or for worse, and this is the thing about the black comedy of the film, is that you see a very deliberate thing that Richter and Kaufman do, which is that the fact that the characters can sort of figure out all on their own and rather intuitively that there is a massive alien conspiracy going on. But Veronica Cartwright's character, because she's the one who, her whole thing is the esoteric and pseudoscience and conspiracy theories, she'll begin talking about this, the alien invasion, and then she'll say something like, well, we just have so many toxins in our food and in the air that we wouldn't even know if we were being contaminated. It's like, yeah, and this is just like when this is, again, like you're saying, this is just like Chariot of the Gods, when the aliens came to Earth and mated with monkey people. And you see Donald Sutherland's character, like, looking at her with this very weird mixture of, I agree with you, but I can't believe that I am agreeing with like all of these insane ramblings. And that's just something that I think the film does very well, is that it really captures something that has only grown, like, I think more pertinent and kind of is, like, I don't think we can go very long without acknowledging like the weird continued relevancy of this version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers in our present moment, where there is so much conspiratorial thinking, there is so much pseudoscientific misinformation that is just profligate in our culture. But it's this weird thing where it's like it
is worth mentioning, though, that by contrast to the era of that film, I think like the age of like pop psych, that's a big backdrop from the film, has sort of at this time kind of given way to pop sociology, which is sort of in its own way almost kind of weirder and more disturbing. But that's a whole other conversation.
I think even the thing about the pop psychology is that, like, if you really break down what Kibner is doing in the film, and obviously, basically the film is, again, it's more of a readaptation of the book, which means that, like, right down to like really basic elements, it is kind of a beat for beat remake of the original film. So this is one of the weird things where I barely even need to elaborate on the plot, because I can just tell people that, well, if you've seen the original film, you know the plot of the remake. It's just that it does everything just a little bit different. And
Yeah, no, that's true. I did appreciate rewatching it. That pretty much all of the important plot points are still present, but they just sort of they happen differently under different circumstances.
yeah. And
But the structure is unchanged.
yeah, and what I think struck me about, like, I guess I went off on a tangent, but like with Kibner, when you really break down his sort of self-help pop psychology, what you realize is that, like, oh, he has a very, like, despite all of his affectations, despite the fact that it's Leonard Nimoy in this very sort of, you know, like this
Cardigan sweater.
yeah, the cardigan sweater, those like
The thing on his hand. I don't know.
yeah,
if
those
you
weird
recall
knuckleless leather gloves.
that was a '70s thing, huh?
Yeah, I guess it must have been, but he
On one hand, only
you
one.
know, like, but when you really break down, despite all of these affectations of him being very much this sort of post-countercultural figure, you know, who is trying to, you know, basically, you know, help cure the ills of society by getting people to address their own individual neuroses and trying to build outward from that. Basically, all of his conclusions are, like, really reactionary. Like, he basically...
One of his clients is the mayor, you know.
Yeah, one of his clients is the mayor.
I like that. I like that little point because, you know, it goes all the way up to the top, man.
Yeah, it's like, but like, and that's the thing. Like, he even has like this whole conversation where it's with Donald Sutherland and Elizabeth, who is played by Brooke Adams in an absolutely
Brooke Adams one of the more exceptionally attractive heroines of 70s cinema, if you ask my personal opinion on the matter.
No, it's definitely true. I think I'm more of a personal fan of
You know, the scene
Veronica
where she-
Cartwright, but yeah,
No,
yeah.
I'm
Brooke Adams is
100% Brooke
definitely
Adams for me.
yeah. Brooke Adams is
I'm
definitely she's definitely very pretty. Like, but
And in the scene where she does the googly eyes thing, that melts
oh
my
yeah,
heart.
oh yeah. There's this
That's
wonderful
you know,
bit.
that's what the weeaboos call moe.
But yeah, like, you know, like, and when he's talking to her and he's talking to Donald Sutherland, basically he just keeps coming back to the same point. It's just like, you know, no one commits to
but like the just the dynamics of the main characters, like, you know, relationships in this movie, like, you know, I'd have to like surgically take it apart to answer the question of why, but you really, like, you buy it.
No,
works
yeah,
really
you do.
well.
Like,
The performances just have a ton of chemistry. Like the four main characters, maybe five with Leonard Nimoy.
yeah, it's like when it's Donald Sutherland and Clute, and he's like, he's making it with Jane, and he's making it with Jane Fonda. I cannot understand how Donald Sutherland is making it with Jane Fonda.
Well,
in
that's
this
because Clute
movie,
is-
you totally
Clute is
understand
really
how he could make it with Brooke Adams. You're like, oh man, this guy is like, he is charming in the extreme. Like, I don't believe that googly eyes scene was on page. I believe that a lot of that had to be improvised at the moment, because how would they know that Brooke Adams could do the googly eyes thing?
It definitely, the delivery in that scene definitely comes across as semi-improvisational. But you know, okay, so talking about Clute, because it has been on my mind exceptionally, because you know, I watched it for the first time a couple years ago, and it became like one of my favorites. In fact, I really want to watch it again. It's been a while, but like, it's, you know, that's a totally different movie than this one,
but very thematically similar. Very much thematically similar.
It's another, you know, paranoid 70s thriller in a totally different mode and style.
I mean, the great thing about the 70s is that it becomes very easy to do that, because so many of these filmmakers, no matter what genre they're working in, are on the sort of same wavelength. And you see that with a lot of the science fiction and horror that comes out of the 70s and the late 60s too. Like, you know, like, just right off the back, like, you know, like Alien, The Shining, The Exorcist, even to a lesser extent movies like The Omen and Rosemary's Baby. You know, like, there's definitely this moment with new Hollywood where you see some of the most interesting new approaches to genre cinema. And not just, science fiction. Clued is an example of like the sort of neo-noir that comes about in the
hard-boiled.
Yeah, but it's hard-boiled, but there's also a kind of like effeminate touch to it. And you see that in Clue. Like, Donald Sutherland, like, basically there's this weird way in that movie where it's kind of this, he is definitely not the sort of conventionally masculine noir hero, but the way they counter...
He's almost like a satire of the conventionally masculine noir hero, because he's like, he's stoic, but he's stoic to an extreme.
But he's almost like a dead-eyed psychopath. Like, he's almost like an altruistic narcissist. Sort of
visibly unhealthy and disturbing.
Yeah,
that he's so emotionally repressed. That is what makes the interesting interplay between him and the Jane Fonda character, because she is, at the opposite end of the spectrum. She's like the kind of satiric apotheosis of this sort of libertinism, of the free love and everything of the 60s, where she sees herself as a liberated woman, but her lifestyle is her libertine lifestyle, ironically, in its own way, imprisons her just as much as sort of accepting the conventional feminine roles of her society, because of the way that it leads directly to her sort of economic and gender-based exploitation.
Right. There's this very much and it's this weird thing with the 70s cinema, is that there's a lot of influence on countercultural signifiers in these movies. But the thing that I've come to realize is that the vast majority of them are absolutely reactionary. And I'm not saying Clued is one of these, but it does have this the same sort of ambivalence about where it's like, where I think that's a fair... it's a fair critique.
Cynical, it's a cynical, I wouldn't call it reactionary, but it's a cynical kind of review of, what are the after effects of the counterculture of the sexual revolution of women's liberation. Where does that leave us?
And I think
I think you could argue that it's the opposite of reactionary, because it's saying that all of these supposed revolutions haven't
they're solipsistic and inwardly drawn. It's the me
Or,
generation.
whatever they've done, they can't really finish their mission without addressing the inequities of class, or the kind of economic exploitation that leads to like gender-based exploitation and so on.
Yeah, and I think with Clued especially, it's more of like a thing of like, how the pursuit of the sort of personal liberation, which is basically just pleasure. It's basically just economic independence and pleasure, contributes to the atomization that only entrenches kind of the inherent inequalities of the society. But like, I guess getting back to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I guess that's a good connecting point, where it's this weird space between, sort of ambivalence and disappointment with the counterculture. But like you say with Clute, where you could argue that there is inherently a kind of anti-reactionary critique, where it's just sort of acknowledging the way in which the counterculture has been totally subsumed into an individualistic, and conservatively motivated society. Because again, like, what does Kibner constantly... what is Kibner constantly talking about? It's like, conventional relationships. Marriages are constantly breaking up. People don't want to commit to relationships anymore. Elizabeth, the reason that you are saying that your husband has been replaced by a pod person is because you're just looking for an excuse to get out of the relationship because you can't hack it.
This has nothing to do with the man that I live with.
It has everything to do with it, don't you see? People are stepping in and out of relationships too fast because they don't want the responsibility. That's why marriages are going to hell. The whole family unit is shot to hell.
David, you're not listening to what she's saying.
Matthew, please stay out of it.
Right. Well, Kipner is the definitive sellout. I mean, Clute is much more sympathetic to Jane Fonda as kind of a tragic, contradictory figure than Invasion of the Body Snatchers is to Kipner as, a hacky snake oil salesman of the mind.
Yeah. Who turns out to literally be working for the pod people.
Spoilers.
He's working for the man.
Well, I think
they're dosing our water.
One of the funny things about that is the film never gives you any indication of at what point Leonard Nimoy became a pod person.
Yeah. Because that's the thing is that, and you see this with the original film, too. It's a little more obvious in the original film, sort of because of what we talked about, where in the 78 film, the weird overlap with the zombie movie, because there's this extent in the 78 film where at first the pod people seem to do a better job in certain circumstances of affecting personality and disguising themselves. But on the other hand, then that just is sort of counterbalanced by the obverse, that once you've been discovered by them, they suddenly transform into just these dead-eyed, shrieking zombies,
yeah, well,
basically.
The shriek is so significant because it means, unlike the first film, there's now an instantly recognizable, jarring thing that in their behavior that makes it unmistakable that they are not human.
Right. And that is the difference, isn't it? Because in the 56 film, you don't have that, but also there's a kind in the 56
film, they're more like us.
Yeah, exactly. It's and so it becomes, but of course in both films it's the kind of the same, because it becomes this thing where it's they say it's sort of the incomplete explanation for what the pod people are. It's well, how do you know they're an imposter? Do they talk differently? No. Do they look different? No, they look exactly the same. Do they have different memories? No, they have all the same memories. Well, do they have a different personality? No, their personality is exactly the same. Well, then how do you know they're a pod person? And you just know intuitively. But then that creates this weird thing where it's exactly like you say, where you see it with Dan Kaufman in the original film, where he actually says explicitly when they, in the parallel scenes in the film where you have, in the first film, it's Miles and Becky hiding out in his practitioner's office, and then they're cornered by Dan Kaufman and Jack, who have both been taken over by the pod people. And there, Dan explicitly says, well, I had already been transformed into a pod when you called me on the night when you discovered the duplicate of Jack. And then in the remake, again, you have Elizabeth and Matthew hiding in their office at the health department. You have Kibner, this version of the psychiatrist, and Jack coming in as pod people. But in there, there's just no acknowledgement. You're saying, there's no acknowledgement of when the change happened for Kibner. And so it creates this really weird sense of because Kibner has done a very good job of affecting emotion to a certain extent where it doesn't even look like he is affecting emotion. It's almost like Leonard Nimoy has not even bothered to play a character affecting emotion. He's very driven. He seems like he's playing a character who has sort of fully accepted that he has sold out in a weird way, that he's become part of this obsequious hive mind. But the
Borg, if you will.
The Borg, if you will. Yeah, definitely. There's this.
He's definitely, Leonard Nimoy is playing just enough to type while spicing it up a little with the cardigan sweaters and the new age speak and everything.
Yeah. I mean, he and that's the weird thing. And that's the thing is that
it's a creative bit of casting.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. Yeah, I guess that is the Spock connection, isn't it? Where Spock, the whole point is that he's an alien who I live without emotion. I only think I must think logically, Captain.
Yes, but then of course you in the end he does have emotion.
Right, and in the end he does have emotion, and that's the weird thing. In the end, the pod people do have emotion. It's just that, like, the saying that they lack emotion is the incomplete answer to the fact that, like we're saying, is that, like, the both in both
They lack
movies.
affect.
Yeah, exactly. In both movies, in both versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there's this understated acknowledgement that saying that all they have is the pretense or the affect of emotion is an incomplete answer to what is understated, which is that, of course, that there's a very obvious allegory going on in both films, which is that even if someone were to transform into a pod person, per se, you wouldn't know, because so many of us do go through life with kind of shallow affectations, with kind of just,
Well,
going
it's
through
the
life.
Post-industrial man.
Right, exactly.
You know, the clockwork man.
At the end of the day, I think what Invasion of the Body Snatchers is that it is less a movie in which there is a clear allegorical relationship for what the pod people represent and any specific cultural or ideological and political movement, and rather that these movies just do a very good job of analogizing the process in the historical moments that they're in dramatizing the process of how the paranoia is sinking in American society. That all we are witnessing is basically a depiction of, this is how, at least in the 70s, this is how the paranoid thinking arises. This is how, these are the social conditions, these are the relationships, and these are the sort of unstated kind of, dysfunctions that contribute to, people saying, oh, there's toxins in our food and in our air, and there's and the FBI and the CIA are all out to get me, like they're already gotten by the pod people. There's some secret, my husband is going out and meeting people he's never met before. And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that,
or
like,
the very first scene with people in it, which I had somehow forgotten, which is the one that's just the bishop in the playground.
yes,
On a swing, just staring at children before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. He's just sitting there staring at children, and I wondered, did they know?
I think that's
Is
the thing.
that-
He's not staring at the children. He's having an unspoken exchange with the teacher. Because that's the thing. If you follow the teacher's eye line, she looks at him, she gives him kind of this blank stare, and then the camera pans over to him, and he's just watching her. And then
Okay,
it
looks like he's staring at the children.
Oh, he is staring at the children, but I think,
and also, he's doing the weird thing where it's like all the children are on the swing set, and then one of the swings is just this full-grown adult bishop.
Yeah, and of course,
and one thing I love about that movie that none of the other versions do is that they keep just putting weird, disturbing background details.
right. It's a very
into...
dense, very densely conceived movie where they just try, like I love the elements of it where it's like you'll see people running in the streets, and early on you'll hear like the body snatcher shriek. But of course, nobody pays attention to it. It's like you see people running desperately,
right.
And
it's
this
part
is
of the whole urban paranoia thing.
Right, exactly.
There's weird stuff happening at the corner of your peripheral vision all the time, but you're not looking at it.
Right, and even that part is not just the paranoia. That part is just the general apathy. It's like, oh, look, someone who seems afraid for their life running through the street, potentially having some kind of nervous breakdown. Well, what am I going to do about it? I've got to get to work. I got up early this morning so that I could go test a rat turd, there's this.
Yeah, but there also are all these shots where in the margins of the frame.
Yeah.
You either see someone just standing and staring straight at the main actors or even at the camera, or someone is just doing something that is just not right.
Right.
And it's great at piling on this gradually accumulating mass of discomforting weirdness wordlessly.
Yeah.
And probably the best and maybe one of the more obvious examples of it, and with something that I think that is also a point of contrast to how easy it is to not get that right, is like the recurring presence of the garbage trucks.
Yeah.
Where it's and this is something I didn't notice until it was pointed out in one of the featurettes. One of the first shots of the movie is the garbage truck coming into the city.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of different times throughout, you see scenes of people dumping things in the garbage disposal, which
Presumably.
it's never.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's never explicitly explained, but at some point you're just expected to. It's expected to dawn on you that they're dumping the shriveled remains of the
the people they've replaced.
Yeah, the ex people that they sucked all the juice out of.
It's just such a densely made movie on all fronts, which only makes it all the more shocking that it was like $3.5 million and that it was produced in the short time that they had. And it only makes it, and of course, like, it only makes it grow in my estimation of everything that it's doing. But it also just comes down to this thing where it's like, you're correct in that each of these movies either attempts to, or I would argue in the 56 and the 78 case, they really capture the zeitgeist of a particular moment. But there is something timeless about the 56 and the 78 versions, I think. Where, like, and I think the reason that I wanted to talk to you, and, the reason I wanted to even address the remake in the first place, and the reason I'm kind of so fixated on Invasion of the Body Snatchers in general, is because of all of the movies that I've seen doing this podcast, and of all of the ones where, I'll pick up little interesting ideas, here and there. I'll find certain things that may be analogous to certain predicaments in our modern society and our ideology and our culture, but at the end of the day, it's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is the one that is almost like the skeleton key. Like in both cases, the filmmakers involved they just were so uniquely just in the zone of like just tapping into and figuring out what the essential neurosis and dysfunction of America is at that particular moment. Where I think in the 56 film, what it is I think beyond all the Red Scare stuff, that the 56 film is basically, for me, it's a movie about contamination. It's a movie about this small American town that suddenly starts going to shit because it basically, like you're saying, it sort of turns in on itself. It sort of cannibalizes itself because it exists only to perpetuate itself. There's no real vision for how to move forward and beyond and to transform something so that it can continue to survive. And on a certain level, I also think that the 56 film is fundamentally, like all of the movies of the 1970s, it is fundamentally a response to the recent history of having to live in a world where nuclear holocaust is a reality.
Well, it's a potentiality.
Right. Yeah, not even just a bomb going off, but like the sort of slow realization of the extent to which radiation is this unique danger that, again, it's sort of like nuclear fallout, comes out of the sky, goes into our soil and into our plants and into our food, into our water. It enters into our bodies.
So it's worth mentioning now that the main character of the Ferrera version is a teenage girl whose father works for the EPA, and he's investigating. It's the whole movie. The 56 one was in suburb. 78 one was in the city. This one is at an army base.
Yeah, that's sort of like like that, and that's the thing. That's part of why I'm interested, because that does seem like a logical place to go.
In theory,
especially in the 90s.
I question whether it works. I question whether it works.
Like, it seems like the 90s version is far more explicitly about,
like,
sort of military-industrial complex and with sort of the unstated, I think that's an interesting way to go because, like, all right, so you start in rural suburbia,
If anything, it's kind of more like environmentalism.
right? Well,
It's
I
in
think
the,
there's
the, the
well,
90s
there's
version with a bit of that, with
yeah,
a bit of like, there's like references to Kuwait. There's
right,
sort of like the conspiratorial specter of like Gulf War syndrome.
right,
There's scenes involving toxic waste.
right.
But I think, I mean, for one thing, like compared to life, civilian life in suburbs or in urbs, the like the conformity and sort of eeriness of military culture is so obvious and so obviously unnatural that like
Well, it's obvious to
it,
you as a cosmopolitan,
well,
urban middle
okay,
class,
yeah,
okay,
but
who exurb to New Jersey, my friend. Like,
yeah, but but I like in general. I'm not saying that necessarily even as a condemnation
no,
of the
I
military. It's
totally
just the
understand
nature.
what you mean. Like, I
Yeah,
understand that you mean like
it's
it's
so
probably
obvious and
not the
has been
most
so
effective.
thoroughly
Yeah, like
it has been so thoroughly explored in cinema already, from so many different genres and so many different angles. It just like it feels that like taking the Body Snatchers metaphor and moving it there, there's just like there's less depth to plumb, psychologically and sociologically. There's just like I don't know.
I think there's a potential for that to be true, and I think there's also this thing where it's like I'm just shocked that like when they made the next one that no one thought, wait, why don't we just go back to rural? Why don't we go to like not even just a rural suburb, not even like this main street Northern California town? Why don't we just go to like Appalachia? Like, why don't we just go to the boonies or the Pine Barrens and see how this shit plays out in a place where all of the people there are themselves completely on the margins of even what is conventionally considered to be part of America, because they're not part of this sort of milquetoast, flag waving, parade down Main Street sort of parochial vision of Midwestern or Southern America. But they're also not part of the urban elite. They're the mutually alienated subject. And like I think that would be like a fantastic and interesting way to explore the concept of paranoia and of conspiracy, because it's like even in a place like Flint, Michigan, like a town like a setting more like Flint, Michigan, or a setting more like Appalachia, you're going to inevitably tap into something and that's the important thing, is that like, I think the important thing is that with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you need to be able to address this fact that we all feel like we know, or whatever our particular moment of anxiety is, we all feel like we can see through the superficial layer of artifice and perceive like the sort of secret order of corruption and evil that is permeating our society. But there's also this conflicting thing where it's like we wouldn't know how to like interpret or to like or to cohere those things. So it's like it becomes the thing where like Veronica Cartwright, all of these things where she's like saying, oh, this is like, we wouldn't even notice if the aliens took us over because we have so many toxins in our food and in our water already because of what the government is experimenting on us with. And so on one level, it's clearly crazy because Veronica Cartwright is like talking about like toxins and like fluoridation in water, as opposed to something more concrete that we know happens, which is the decline in regulation. It's like this sort of thing where it's like it becomes this thing where I think with the 78 film in particular, it becomes this sort of dawning awakening where we we know that conspiracies happen all the time because we have been through a period in which there were two really high-profile conspiracies that were revealed at the highest levels of our military and government. And then even progressively throughout the 70s, we sort of realize even more and more. It's like, oh, here's COINTELPRO. It turns out all of those black activists and indigenous American activists and white militant activists, it turns out they were all right. The FBI really was infiltrating their organizations and trying to subterfuge them from the inside and using illegal spying tactics. And, it's like, then it's this weird thing where it's like, and that's the crisis, and this is why I think the movies are both so relevant, is that we're at this really critical point in America right now where we are in the midst of one of the most profuse and hyper-diffused conspiracy theories that is now no longer just a marginal kind of hysteria. It is totally reaching a point where it is becoming entirely mainstream, where there are senators in our country who are being elected, who are the QAnon senators, the people who believe that there is a secret cabal of satanic pedophiles that are controlling the world and controlling the American government. But at the same time, our only response to those things, at least on a mainstream level, seems to just be to shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's crazy. Well, they're stupid. Well, they're ignorant. We just, how do you want us to deal with this fact? But then I approach it as someone who, I'm approaching this as someone who grew up in the Catholic Church. And so if someone says to me, can you believe that there are people who believe that that at the highest orders of power in our society that there's ritualized child abuse and sex trafficking? And I just look at them and I'm just like, dude, I'm an ex-Catholic. We know that shit happens all the time. The problem isn't the premise. The problem isn't the idea that these things happen all the time. The problem is that that people have no way of determining that the banality of it never really coheres in people's minds. And it's this weird thing where it's like with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, with the 78 one in particular, I think it's the perfect distillation of how that sort of thought processes takes place. Because if you take out everything in this movie having to do with pod people, all you are left with is this is what happens when there is a mass hysteria of people who all understand the truth. There really is a breakdown in society that's occurring in the 70s. There really is increased financialization. There really is an increased movement of industry from inside America to cheaper manufacturing hubs internationally. There really is a destruction of labor. There really is less regulation. There really are these atomizing and alienating processes that are occurring, but the banal explanation isn't enough, because there's no it's not as easy to conceptualize that as it is to say, well, there's something attacking my essence. That's the problem, is that there's something that is
not that there isn't that too.
Right, no, absolutely. And this is the fucking problematic thing, is where it's we're in this moment right now where I couldn't think of a more relevant work of pop culture, American pop culture, than ever to explain what's going on. But at the end of the day, conspiracy theories are becoming so much more popular and so much more prominent. But at the end of the day, I just have to sort of shrug my shoulder and be like, well, what do you want me to do? Tell these people that they're crazy? They're not crazy. They're just wrong. Anybody who is advocating the point of view that that this is insane, that we don't all intuitively know what people are talking about when they say it just feels like, that there is this invisible order that doesn't give a shit about me. And in fact, it would be totally content if we were literally to just die of coronavirus because we literally can't not work. We literally can't not work at these shitty jobs for these shitty benefits, for this money that is not going to give us a stable living. It's just like, and I'm sorry, I'm rambling a second, but all of this is basically to say that I think that people need to go back and watch this movie because there are so many ways in which it is just uniquely predictive of the neuroses that are now literally tearing this country apart because they've just been unaddressed for so long.
I mean, I didn't prepare a fancy thesis like that, but it is to your credit. I was watching a couple of like clips and videos about the movie on YouTube last night, and I saw a comment on one of the videos that was typical YouTube comment section genius caliber. It was like 1979 it was Attack of the Pod People, and now in 2020 it's Attack of the Masked People.
Ugh. Oh my god. It's true though. It's like true. It's like, this is how this is how it happens.
Which part is true?
Well, it's true.
The people trying to
it's
people,
true that
people wearing masks are the pod people.
No, the people who are wearing masks aren't the pod people. And that's the thing. The fundamental lesson of Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
don't get a contagion.
Don't get a contagion, but we are all already the pod people. It's already happened. We went
we're en route to becoming them anyway.
Right, exactly. It's like, but that's the thing. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, well, you have to stay awake. You have to be awake. I'm sorry, we can't stay awake forever. We have, at a certain point, the allure of just receding into the playground of our dreams and our imagination. I mean, at the end of the day, that's why this anti-masker stuff and QAnon and all of this, like the Antifa super soldiers, the George Soros funded Antifa, that's the reason that these things become such an integral part of people's lives, and why in the moment where people have been forced to isolate as a public health, as a bare minimum, and perhaps even sub-bare minimum public health measure, they're forced to isolate. They can't go to the bar anymore. They can't cope in the way that they're used to. So now you have millions of people all over this country who are just uniquely sitting with the misery that it has been much easier to just get that dopamine into their arms and just cope with it. And now all of them are just at home on the internet going down these rabbit holes. And this is the thing. The reason these things are alluring is the same reason that a movie like Invasion of the Body Snatchers is alluring, and They Live is alluring. It's not because there isn't a kernel of truth in all of these conspiracies. It's that it's fun. It makes life into a game. It gives you an excuse to go out in the world, and you're playing the hero, and you're like Jeff Goldblum running down the pier as this triumphalist music plays where he's saying, "Come and get me, you pod scum." One of the best lines in the movie that you barely hear. But this is what is happening. People are like, that's the thing. It's like people are trying to game out. It's basically life is becoming an augmented reality game for so many people, where it's just the opportunity to live through this high concept fantasy world, because most people, including myself, and I'm not putting myself on a pedestal here, but so few people have the tools at their disposal to really acknowledge that even if all the conspiracies were true, how would that be fundamentally different from just a banal order of things? You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to make this podcast about just my own pet bloviating theories about what is particularly basically suffice it to say, I just think that I don't really have I don't really have the unified theory yet But I think it comes down to this thing where it's just, like I said, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is just kind of the distillation. It's the skeleton key to understanding American psychology and how we get first from the point of atom age anxieties, living in the moment of the atom, the bomb, and radiation, and all of the subtle things that...
But I feel like, I gotta say, I feel like it's not so much about the atom bomb or, I mean, beyond the fact that that's just, something that inevitably informs the culture of the last 60 years. But, if anything, I would say, particularly the 56 version, it's more about the sort of, the atomization and sort of, the synthesization, if that's a word, and mass reproduction of the things that supposedly make us human that are characteristic of post-industrial capitalism.
Right.
And I feel like it's more what the movies are all about, all four of them in varying degrees, is this psychosocial anxiety of alienation and invasion that is the scales tip between psychological and social, but it's all it's all a little more abstract and not quite at the level of material politics.
It's a conspiracy. I know it.
There can't be a conspiracy.
Matthew, I'm telling you, something's going on here. Something that scares me.
This is something that, like, is one of the most wonderful things about the 78 film, is that, I guess this is the other thing, is that, like, the 78 film emerges in this very unique time where suddenly horror movies are not just for teenagers going to the drive-in or puerile hormonal teenagers just making out in the aisles of their local.
Well, this one sort of is, because it's implausibly rated PG.
Wait, what? Really?
Yeah, somehow, despite having.
Well, it has titties.
Yeah,
God, I forgot.
Has
Oh
a
my
full 50% of Brooke Adams, and also a scene gorier than anything in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where
her body disintegrates.
Right. Oh no! I'm thinking of that's a purely a fantasy effect, but the scene where
oh yeah, he
Donald
bashes
Sutherland
in his own.
Yeah, he smashes over in his duplicate's face with a rake, and it's the gore is fairly realistic.
God, movies were so much better when there wasn't a PG-13. Like, the things that you could get away taking a child to see with you, can you imagine how much cooler it was being younger than 13
I don't know how
in the
this would have gotten
70s?
away with it. I don't know how that, with the two scenes in question, I don't think they would have gotten by with a PG-13.
No, they wouldn't. But
I think it's purely a bizarre artifact of the 70s.
Jaws is like that too, but I think Jaws ended up being re-rated. It was Invasion.
But Jaws doesn't have female presenting nipples.
Right. Airplane does. That was PG too.
I forgot that.
Oh my God, it was such a better time.
Monty Python's Flying Circus did, and it was on TV.
Okay, but look, you know what I mean, which is that yes, it's rated a certain thing, but it's clear that the 78 Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a movie for adults. At least I think, because like all right, well, I mean, but it's part of this.
It's a movie of broader accessibility.
It does have broad accessibility, but
it's not for kids, that's for sure.
Right.
It's I mean, I think I first saw it in high school, and it became one of my favorites at that time. I would not necessarily say it's so exclusively an adult movie, because I think like most movies that incorporate such a fantastical metaphorical reimagining of some experience, they tend to be pretty broadly accessible to people, beyond, with more degrees of separation removed from the thing that it's ostensibly representing, which is probably also why sci-fi and fantasy movies tend to be, and I guess literature too, tend to be so import and export friendly compared to realistic dramas.
Yeah.
But
I don't know. I guess I kind of overshot on my point there. I guess all I was trying to say is that, like, you're right about the accessibility there, but like I think there's this thing where it's like, Philip Kaufman was a guy who, born in 1936, so he would have been in his 20s when he saw the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. You could imagine these movies, like this is a movie that people who grew up in the 50s or came of age in the 50s would know what Invasion of the Body Snatchers was. It was a widely distributed film at the very beginnings of an explosion in drive-in horror and science fiction films. It was, so it's one of these things where it's like there's this element of the movie that is distinctly nostalgic and knowingly self-referential, because of course Kevin McCarthy himself makes a cameo in the film as basically his same character from the original film, running through the streets, banging on windows, trying to get everyone's attention before he's run down and killed by the pod people. And so
John Siegel, incidentally, is also in the film.
Yeah, he's in the
He's the
book.
cab driver.
He's the cab driver?
Yeah.
Oh man, I can't believe I missed that. Oh my god! And of course, he's a pod person now. They got to him.
Yeah,
Everybody involved
in the
cab
driver.
Everyone involved in the making of the original, they got to them. They got to the pod. The pod people got to them. But yeah, there's like this. So there's this interesting thing where the 50s version is kind of associated with this period of kind of, with the baby boom, with all of this explosion of teenagers who have more disposable income. They have a lot of leisure time. And so much of American film culture becomes oriented around realizing that you're never going to be able to capture the same broad audiences that you were in the 30s and 40s. Those days are over. Your bread and butter is going to be the youth demographic. And so what's interesting, though, is that as that youth demographic comes of age, as it goes through, again, these this explosion of optimism in the counterculture and in the civil rights era, but then this incredibly dispiriting snowball afterward and a kind of retreat inward, that in a weird way, like another way of looking at Invasion of the Body Snatchers is as a work of nostalgia that kind of predicts the future of American cinema in a weird way, where despite its very dark and bleak ending, it's kind of defined by a sort of like sense of returning to the culture and the sort of the defining of our social engagement around movies and around what we consume.
Well, that's just, like we were talking about before, that's just sort of another ingredient of New Hollywood, isn't it? New Hollywood was the generation of movie nostalgia. Or the initial generation of movie nostalgia, because it was the initial generation of filmmakers produced by people who had grown up on films. So, that was when you had people like Bogdanovich, Lucas, so on and so forth.
Steven Spielberg, of course.
Yeah, Spielberg, yeah. And those are the super obvious examples.
Brian De Palma, just making an entire career off of transparent, Alfred Hitchcock homages. Yeah, like, is there anything else you'd like to Any other lingering thoughts before I take it in? We're actually going a little bit over, but like any other lingering thoughts that you, just a final word on Invasion of the Body Snatchers?